Imagine you've just developed, you've built this revolutionary new medical scanner.
Yeah.
And you roll it out to a city of like 100,000 perfectly healthy feeling people.
Right.
It's this highly sensitive piece of tech. In fact, it's 95% accurate.
Which is pretty incredible for a medical test.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you scan the population, the machine does its thing, and you hand out the results to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But what if I told you that out of everyone who got a terrifying positive result from your incredible new scanner, 98% of them were completely false alarms?
Yeah, that's the great paradox we're dealing with today.
Right. So welcome to our deep dive. Whether you're a medical student prepping for boards, a public health trainee, or honestly just an insanely curious mind, this deep dive is designed specifically for you.
We are going to build your conceptual framework around one of the most, well, probably the most debated, counterintuitive topics in modern medicine.
It really is. It's this area where our basic human intuition, that deeply ingrained belief that having more information about our bodies is just always better.
Yeah, it just collides violently with the actual mathematical and systemic realities of epidemiology.
Exactly. So our mission today is to deeply explore Chapter 11.4, which is Population Screening and Public Health from the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health.
It's a fantastic chapter.
It really is. And I want to set up this overarching metaphor for us to return to throughout our conversation today.
Okay, let's hear it.
When we talk about population screening, I want you to visualize the security checkpoint at a massive international mega airport.
Oh, right.
Picture the X-ray scanners, the metal detectors, those huge, long lines of impatient travelers winding through the terminal.
That's actually the perfect conceptual anchor for this.
Right.
Because it perfectly illustrates the dual concepts of calibration and consequence.
Yeah. Think about how that security scanner has to be calibrated by the engineers. If they make the scanners mesh too fine, meaning, it has extremely high sensitivity but very low specificity, it's going to beep for absolutely everything.
Right. It beeps for a metal zipper.
Exactly. A stray coin at the bottom of a bag, or like a foil chewing gum wrapper.
And we've all been in that line.
We have.
Phew.
And what happens to the airport? The security line just grinds to a complete halt. Absolute panic ensues.
Yeah, you have your most highly trained security personnel wasting immense resources.
Right. They're pulling innocent people aside, doing these invasive pat-downs, investigating totally non-threats.
All while thousands of people are missing their actual flights.
Exactly. But then the flip side is equally dangerous. Right?
Oh, absolutely. If you dial that same scanner down too much, just to, keep the line moving and avoid those false alarms,
yeah,
then a real catastrophic threat slips right through undetected.
Which is the nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
So population screening is essentially the ultimate public health challenge of calibrating this exact kind of scanner.
But you're doing it for an entire population of asymptomatic people.
Right, people who feel totally fine.
Yeah.
And the stakes aren't just missed flights.
No, the stakes are human lives.
Lives, immense systemic healthcare costs, and really profound ethical dilemmas.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because screening isn't just, a simple blood test your doctor orders during a checkup.
No, it's a massive, system-wide public health intervention.
Right.
And that is the critical baseline distinction we have to establish before we go any further.
Okay, yeah. Lay it out for us.
Before we can even talk about calibrating our airport scanner, we have to understand what the scanner is actually built to do and who is being asked to walk through it.
Because there's a lot of confusion about that. Right?
A massive amount of confusion, even among practicing doctors, honestly, about what the word screening actually means in a public health context.
I have to admit, I used to fall into that exact trap. Yeah. Like if I went to my primary care doctor for a physical and they ordered a routine cholesterol panel or, checked my blood sugar,
Right.
I always just assumed I was being screened for heart disease or diabetes.
You are definitely not alone in that assumption. But clinical practitioners and patients misuse the term constantly.
So what's the actual difference?
We have to strictly differentiate between true population screening versus what we call case finding or opportunistic testing.
Okay. Opportunistic testing.
Yeah. The distinction lies entirely in the system and the target. Let's look at case finding first.
Sure.
If a clinician sees a diabetic patient and tests them annually for retinal disease, that is not population screening.
Because they're already diabetic.
Exactly. That is testing an existing patient for a known complication of a disease they already have.
Gotcha.
Or, to use your example, if you go to the clinic complaining of fatigue or even just for a routine checkup, and the doctor opportunistically offers you an HIV test or a cholesterol panel while you just happen to be sitting in the exam room, that is opportunistic case finding.
Because I'm already in the healthcare system at that point. I've already, crossed the threshold of the clinic.
Precisely. You initiated the contact. True population screening is entirely different.
How so?
It systematically targets asymptomatic, ostensibly healthy populations.
Right.
It's a public health service where members of a defined population, people who do not necessarily perceive themselves to be at risk.
People who are just sitting at home feeling perfectly fine.
Right. They are actively invited to take a test. The public health system is the one initiating the contact.
Wow.
The goal is to identify individuals within that healthy-feeling population who are more likely to be helped than harmed by further tests or treatment.
So like a national breast cancer or cervical cancer screening program.
Exactly. You are reaching out into the community to find the healthy public.
You're literally sending out letters in the mail to thousands of people who feel perfectly fine, saying, hey, please take a day off work, come to our facility, and let us put you through our scanner.
Yeah, it's a massive operational undertaking.
Where did this idea even start? When did public health decide to start inviting healthy people to become patients?
Historically, we can trace the modern concept of systematic population screening back to the period just after 1946.
Okay, post-war.
Right. That post-war era was a fascinating time for public health because effective treatments for tuberculosis finally became available.
Oh, right. Before that, finding TB early didn't really help much.
Exactly. It didn't drastically change the outcome, so population screening wasn't particularly useful. But once they had treatments, public health officials started using mass miniature radiography, or MMR.
Let's unpack MMR for a second because we throw that acronym around a lot in public health history. What did that actually look like on the ground?
It was a highly visible, almost theatrical public health intervention.
Theatrical?
Yeah. MMR used small 35mm film to take chest x-rays. Because the film was small and the process was relatively fast, they could mount these x-ray machines inside mobile vans.
Oh, wow.
They would roll these vans into town squares, factory parking lots, community centers, and literally scan the public for tuberculosis.
That must have seemed like magic at the time.
It really did. It seemed like an absolute miracle of modern medicine. You find the disease before the patient even knows they are sick, you administer the newly discovered treatments, and you save their life.
Wow.
It was a massive success that deeply, deeply embedded the idea of early detection into the public consciousness.
And I imagine that triumph with TB radiography basically opened the floodgates.
Right, completely.
Suddenly, the medical community probably thought, hey, if we could do this for TB, we should do this for absolutely everything.
That is the exact historical trajectory, and that enthusiasm eventually necessitated some ground rules.
Which led to the famous 1968 Wilson and Junger criteria.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. The World Health Organization saw this massive enthusiasm for screening and realized it could quickly get out of hand.
Yeah, I bet.
So J.M.G. Wilson from the UK Ministry of Health and G. Jungner from Sweden realized that screening was a double-edged sword. Their 1968 criteria, published by the WHO, basically laid out the constitutional rules for when you should and shouldn't roll out these massive public health scanners.
They established that you shouldn't just screen populations simply because you happen to have invented a cool new test.
Exactly.
So what were some of the key hurdles a disease had to clear under Wilson and Junger?
The criteria are quite comprehensive, but the core principles dictate that the condition must be an important health problem.
Right. You don't screen populations for trivial ailments.
Exactly. Furthermore, the natural history of the disease, like how it develops from latent to active phases, that must be deeply understood.
Because if you don't know how the disease progresses, finding it early doesn't tell you what to do.
Precisely. And crucially, there must be an effective, accepted treatment for patients with recognized disease.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Screening for a disease that has no cure or treatment is generally considered unethical.
Because you're just giving someone a timeline of their own demise without offering any way to help them.
Exactly. You're just causing anxiety. Additionally, the test itself must be acceptable to the population.
Meaning?
Well, if a test is so invasive or painful that no one will agree to take it, the program will fail regardless of its scientific merit.
Right. People just won't show up to the vans.
Exactly.
Which brings us to this massive, almost bizarre shift in attitudes that the textbook highlights. This is like the great paradox of modern screening.
It really is.
If we look back half a century ago, medical professionals were incredibly eager to screen for everything. They were the ones pushing the boundaries.
They were.
But today, if you talk to public health experts, epidemiologists, and policymakers, they are the ones aggressively hitting the brakes. They're highly cautious.
They are cautious because they now have decades of long-term data showing the hidden systemic harms of screening.
We've moved past that honeymoon phase of the 50s and 60s.
Exactly. But conversely, while the professionals have grown really skeptical, the general public absolutely loves screening.
I mean, I completely get the public's perspective.
Of course.
The mantra, early detection saves lives, is drilled into us from childhood. It's ubiquitous.
It's everywhere.
We have massive disease charities doing 5K fun runs for awareness, everyone wearing colored ribbons. You have commercial clinics setting up mobile screening units in supermarket parking lots, offering like full-body MRI scans for a few $100s.
Yeah, the demand from the public is absolutely skyrocketing.
But I have to play devil's advocate here, speaking for the listener who might be wondering the exact same thing.
Go for it.
Wait, isn't finding a disease early always a good thing? Like, why would public health officials ever want to hit the brakes on giving people more information about their own bodies?
What's fascinating here is the collision between our individual emotional intuition and the cold reality of population-level data.
Okay, unpack that.
The assumption is that finding a disease early gives you a head start. But finding a disease early is not always a good thing if that disease was never actually going to harm you in your lifetime.
Wait, really?
Yes. It is not a good thing if the test itself causes massive, debilitating psychological anxiety.
Right.
And it is certainly not a good thing if the treatment for that early, completely harmless disease leaves you permanently physically disabled.
Wow. Okay.
Furthermore, we have to acknowledge that governments and commercial entities have their own motives that totally muddy the waters here.
You're talking about the political and commercial drivers of healthcare policy.
Exactly. Governments are often willing to fund large-scale screening programs that have very marginal or even questionable clinical benefits.
Why?
Simply because a screening program is a highly visible, easily understood political deliverable.
Oh, wow. It allows politicians to show they care about a specific disease constituency.
Exactly. They can stand at a podium and say, look, we listened to your advocacy group and we gave you a national screening program.
Even if the math doesn't support it.
Right. And it turns disease prevention into a massive commercial enterprise.
Because of the economics of it all.
Think about it. You have the continuous supply of chemical reagents, the manufacturing and maintenance of the scanning equipment.
Rise of private diagnostic clinic.
Exactly. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So critics within public health who advocate for caution, who look at the data and say, wait, the mortality benefits don't justify the harms here, they are often publicly attacked.
Or professionally undermined.
Yes, because they are going against this deeply ingrained, heavily funded narrative that early detection is an absolute moral good.
Okay, to truly understand why the professionals are hitting the brakes, despite the public outcry for more tests, we have to look under the hood.
We do.
We need to examine the mathematics of the scanner. Because in public health, human intuition often fails spectacularly where epidemiology prevails.
It really does.
We need to deeply explore the concepts of specificity, sensitivity, and prevalence.
This is where we separate the clinical individual mindset from the public health population level mindset. The math is just non-negotiable.
So let's break down the mechanics of the test itself, and let's try to do it without getting bogged down in too much heavy statistical jargon.
Okay, good idea.
Let's talk about sensitivity versus specificity.
Let's do it.
Imagine you're a commercial fisherman out on the open ocean.
Okay.
High sensitivity is like having a massive fine mesh net. You throw that net into the water, and you're going to catch absolutely every single fish in the ocean.
The sensitivity of your net is incredible.
It is. But because the mesh is so incredibly fine, you're also pulling up old rubber boots, discarded tires, and empty soda cans from the ocean floor.
Right.
That is high sensitivity in medical testing.
Uh-huh.
You catch all the true positives, meaning you find everyone who actually has the disease, but you also catch a lot of junk.
Which are the false positives. That is a brilliant way to visualize it. And then you have the opposing metric, high specificity.
Right. So high specificity is a fishing net designed so perfectly with such specific geometric holes that absolutely nothing but a true fish can get caught in it.
Okay.
If something is wriggling in that net when you pull it up, with 100% certainty it's a fish. No boots, no tires, no false positives.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, because the holes in the net are designed so rigidly to exclude everything else, a few actual unusually shaped fish might manage to swim right through.
Ah, I see.
You get the true negatives right, you correctly leave the boots on the ocean floor, but you might have some false negatives. You miss a few fish.
Clinicians naturally are obsessed with sensitivity.
Really, why?
Well, when a doctor has a patient sitting in front of them in the exam room complaining of symptoms, their primary overriding fear is missing a life-threatening diagnosis.
They do not want to let a sick fish slip through the net and send them home to die.
Exactly. So they demand the most sensitive test possible. They are willing to deal with a few false alarms to ensure they catch everything.
Makes total sense for a sick patient.
But in population screening, where you are testing tens of thousands of entirely healthy-feeling people who have no symptoms whatsoever, specificity is king.
Wait, why is that the case? Why does a public health director care more about avoiding the boots and tires than catching every single fish? That sounds almost counterintuitive to saving lives.
Because of a mathematical phenomenon known as the prevalence trap.
The prevalence.
Yes, and it directly determines what we call the positive predictive value, or PPV.
PPV.
Right. The PPV is arguably the most important metric for an individual patient.
Why is it so important for the patient?
Because the PPV answers the exact question a terrified patient asks when they get a call from the clinic. If my test comes back positive, what is the actual statistical probability that I truly have the disease?
And this is where the math absolutely breaks our brains.
It really does.
Let's look at the data point provided in Table 11.4.2 of the Oxford text. This is a staggering example that perfectly illustrates the trap.
Let's walk through it.
Let's say we've developed a screening test that is 95% sensitive and 95% specific.
Okay.
To a layperson, or even to many doctors, a test that is 95% accurate in both directions sounds incredible.
It sounds like a nearly perfect piece of medical technology.
Right. But we have to factor in the underlying prevalence of the disease in the population we are screening.
And conditions that we screen for in asymptomatic populations are, by definition, usually quite rare.
Right.
Let's say the prevalence of the specific disease in the healthy population is 0.1%.
0.1%. Okay.
That means only 1 in 1,000 people actually have the hidden disease.
Okay, let's run the actual numbers step by step so you, the listener, can follow the logic here.
Let's do it.
We take our 95% accurate scanner and we screen 100,000 perfectly healthy-feeling people. At a 0.1% prevalence rate, exactly 100 of those people actually have the hidden disease somewhere in their body.
Right.
Because our test is 95% sensitive, it does its job beautifully. It correctly identifies 95 of those sick people. It only misses 5 of them.
So far, this looks like a massive public health victory.
It really does. But here is where the prevalence trap springs shut.
Yep.
What happens to the other 99,900 people in our sample who do not have the disease?
Well, our test is 95% specific.
Right.
That means it correctly identifies 94,905 people as perfectly healthy and disease-free.
Okay.
But it has a 5% error rate for false positives. It's going to catch some boots and tires.
Okay, let me do the math. 5% of those 99,900 healthy people is exactly 4,995 people.
Correct.
Wait, hold on. Let me make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. The scanner beeps for the 95 people who actually have the disease, and it beeps for 4,995 people who are completely 100% healthy.
Exactly. So out of everyone who received a positive result in the mail, everyone the scanner beeped for, you have a total of 5,090 positive tests generated by the system.
But only 95 of those people are actually sick.
Meaning the positive predictive value, the actual chance that a positive test means you have the disease, is 95 divided by the total 5,090 positive results.
Which comes out to 1.9%.
Yes.
Wow.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of public health policy, a 95% accurate test used on a rare disease in a healthy population means that out of every 100 positive results handed to terrified patients,
98 of them are entirely false alarms.
98 of them.
That is just staggering. A 98% false alarm rate from a test that is fundamentally 95% accurate.
It is.
This is exactly why public health officials lose sleep at night when politicians demand universal screening programs.
They lose sleep because a false positive in a national screening program doesn't just mean a brief moment of worry for the patient.
What does it actually mean on the ground?
It means tens of thousands of healthy people are forcefully pushed into unnecessary, highly invasive diagnostic pathways.
Right.
They are subjected to surgical biopsies, they get exposed to cumulative radiation from follow-up CT scans, they have to take days off work.
And they suffer severe, sometimes lasting psychological distress.
Exactly. All of this collateral damage is inflicted for disease they never actually had.
The text gives a fantastic real-world application of this exact mathematical trap regarding screening for beta thalassemia.
Yes, the genetic blood disorder.
Right. It affects the production of hemoglobin. They look at a metric called mean cell hemoglobin, or MCH, which measures the amount of hemoglobin per red blood cell. If you set the MCH cutoff threshold at 27 picograms, the sensitivity of the test is 100%.
You will successfully catch every single carrier of the genetic trait.
But in geographic areas where the baseline prevalence of beta thalassemia is low, the positive predictive value drops to an abysmal 1.3%.
Which means your healthcare system is suddenly buried under an avalanche of follow-up appointments, genetic counseling sessions, and partner testing for false alarms.
Exactly. But look at the systemic impact of making a minor adjustment to improve specificity.
It's a great example.
The text notes that by adding one very simple, non-invasive question to the screening process, specifically asking the patient about their family origins and geographic ancestry.
Right, since thalassemia is much more prevalent in certain Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and South Asian populations.
Yeah, by asking that one question, you drastically increase the specificity of the initial screen.
Because you are essentially pre-filtering the population to increase the underlying prevalence of the group you actually test.
And what's the actual result of adding that one question?
By increasing the specificity in that manner, the need to recall the patient's partner for follow-up genetic testing plummeted from 1 in every 61 pregnancies down to 1 in 1,497.
Wow. 1 in 61 to 1 in almost 1,500.
That is roughly a 96% reduction in partner recall.
Think about the massive healthcare resources saved by that single adjustment, the lab time, the genetic counselor hours.
And far more importantly, think about the thousands of expectant couples spared from the agonizing anxiety of thinking their unborn child might inherit a severe genetic disorder.
All because of a statistical false positive.
Exactly.
Which brings us perfectly to the next major conceptual framework: the hidden iceberg of opportunity costs and overdiagnosis.
This is crucial.
We now see clearly that the mathematics of screening practically guarantee a mountain of false alarms. But a false alarm on an epidemiologist's spreadsheet is very different from a false alarm in a human life.
Very different.
When those mathematical false alarms hit the real-world healthcare system, what is the actual collateral damage?
To understand the damage, we have to deeply reconceptualize our definition of harm in medicine.
Okay, how so?
The pioneering epidemiologist Archie Cochrane and Walter Holland emphasized a unique foundational ethical feature of screening.
Right.
Unlike routine clinical medicine, where a sick person comes to a doctor asking for help, in screening, the health provider is actively inviting a healthy person to take a test.
Right, you're knocking on their door. They didn't ask for this.
And by extending that invitation, there is a strong implicit promise being made by the state or the healthcare provider that undergoing this test will fundamentally benefit them.
That makes sense.
Therefore, the threshold for avoiding harm must be set incredibly high. We're intervening in a healthy life, which is ethically far more precarious than intervening in a sick life.
Table 11.4.1 in the text explicitly lays out these harms, and it is a really sobering list.
It is.
There's the issue of false reassurance for the false negatives. These are the people who actually have the disease, but the test misses it.
Right. Because they got a clear result, they might ignore future obvious symptoms thinking they're safe, delaying necessary treatment.
Then there's the severe psychological anxiety for the false positives that we just mathematically proved are inevitable. There are the physical hazards of the test itself, like the cumulative radiation exposure from decades of annual mammograms or the risk of bowel perforations during screening colonoscopies.
Yes, the test itself can be dangerous.
But I want to ask you for a deep clarification on one specific, highly controversial harm mentioned: overdiagnosis.
Overdiagnosis is perhaps the most difficult concept for both the public and practicing clinicians to truly grasp.
Why is that?
Because it challenges our fundamental understanding of what a disease actually is.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Overdiagnosis occurs when a screening test correctly finds an abnormality, like a slow-growing cluster of cancer cells, that strictly meets the pathological microscopic definition of a disease. Okay.
but which would never have grown large enough to cause clinical symptoms or lead to death during the patient's natural lifetime.
Hold on, let me make sure I'm tracking this. Are you saying we're finding real cancer, but it's cancer that wouldn't have hurt them?
Yes.
How do we tell a patient, good news, we found cancer in your body, bad news, we shouldn't do anything about it? That sounds like clinical malpractice.
It is incredibly counterintuitive and emotionally distressing.
I can imagine.
The core problem is that our diagnostic imaging technology has vastly outpaced our predictive pathology.
Meaning our cameras are better than our crystal balls.
Exactly. When we find these microscopic, indolent abnormalities on a high-resolution MRI or a mammogram, our pathologists usually cannot predict with 100% certainty which of those tiny clusters will stay dormant forever and which ones will suddenly mutate and become aggressively lethal.
Because we don't have a crystal ball.
Exactly. And because we can't tell the difference at that microscopic stage, the medical protocol dictates that we treat all of them.
Oh, wow. This leads directly to the phenomenon of overtreatment.
So we're treating people who don't need it.
We are performing invasive surgeries, administering toxic chemotherapy, and delivering radiation therapy to people who would have naturally lived a long, happy life and died of something completely unrelated.
Like old age or a heart attack decades later.
Right. Without ever knowing they had a tiny, dormant tumor. We are literally turning healthy people into cancer patients.
Burdening them with all the physical morbidity, psychological trauma, and financial toxicity that entails, for zero actual survival benefit.
Exactly. Take DCIS, for example.
DCIS, ductal carcinoma in situ. That comes up a lot in the breast cancer screening debates. Let's unpack that.
In situ literally means in its original place. DCIS is a collection of abnormal cells inside the milk ducts of the breast.
Okay.
Autopsy studies of women who died of entirely non-breast cancer-related causes, like car accidents, show that a significant percentage of women have DCIS in their breasts and never knew it. It often never spreads or causes harm, but routine mammography is incredibly good at finding DCIS.
So the scanner finds it.
And once it is found, because we can't be absolutely sure it won't become invasive, the standard of care often involves lumpectomies, mastectomies, or radiation.
That is the essence of overdiagnosis and overtreatment driven by screening.
Yes.
This feeds directly into the massive economic realities of screening, what economists call opportunity costs.
Exactly.
Funding a national screening program means you are explicitly choosing not to fund something else in the healthcare system.
Precisely. Health economics evaluates these decisions using metrics like QLI's quality-adjusted life years and DALY's disability-adjusted life years.
Let's define QLIs for the listeners who might be new to health economics. How is a QLI calculated?
A QLI is a way to measure the value of a medical intervention by combining both the length of life and the quality of that life.
Okay.
1 year of perfect health equals 1 QLOI. Death equals 0.
Makes sense.
If a screening program extends a patient's life by 10 years, but those 10 years are spent in agonizing pain or severe disability due to the side effects of overtreatment, health economists assign a fraction to those years, say 0.5. So that 10-year survival only generated 5 QALYs.
Oh, I see.
Policymakers use this calculus to determine if a screening program provides actual value for money.
So if we spend $100 million finding 10 extra cancers, but that same $100 million could have funded 10,000 life-changing hip replacements that vastly improve QALYs for the elderly.
That is the opportunity cost.
Right. And the textbook points out that the full systemic costs of providing a screening program are almost always severely underestimated at the initial planning stages.
Oh, always. Because politicians and planners often only calculate the unit cost of the test itself.
They look at the price of the reagent or the scanner.
Right.
But what are the hidden costs they're missing?
It's the massive hidden infrastructure. It's the bespoke IT systems needed to actively track millions of people, ensuring they get their invitations, reminders, and results.
Yeah.
It's the administrative cost of the quality assurance boards. It's the entire chain of activities.
It's a chain of activities.
Yeah. If you initiate a screening program and find 1,000 people who need immediate follow-up biopsies, do you actually have the surgical capacity? the pathology lab technicians, and the social care workers to handle that sudden influx of patients.
If you don't.
If you don't, the screening program is worse than useless. It actively harms the existing healthcare system by creating massive bottlenecks that delay care for patients who are already genuinely sick.
Wow. And these economic models, even when done correctly, are incredibly fragile over time.
They really are.
Look at the textbook's case study on abdominal aortic aneurysm, or AAA, screening.
Mm.
An aneurysm is a ballooning of the main artery in the abdomen.
Right, and if it bursts, it's often catastrophic and fatal.
But ultrasound screening can find it before it bursts.
Yes, and the original randomized controlled trials in the 1990s proved that AAA ultrasound screening for men over 65 was highly cost-effective and saved lives.
But those trials were conducted decades ago, back when societal smoking rates were much, much higher.
Exactly. And smoking is one of the most significant risk factors for developing an abdominal aortic aneurysm.
So over the last few decades, because other public health campaigns successfully convinced millions of people to quit smoking, the actual baseline prevalence of AAA in the general population has plummeted.
And because the prevalence dropped.
The positive predictive value of the screening test dropped along with it.
And the cost-effectiveness models warped entirely. The math no longer works the way the original trials promised it would.
You're now spending millions of dollars to run a national screening program to find a disease that has largely vanished due to upstream prevention efforts.
Which is exactly why Lawrence Gostin, a prominent public health scholar, notes that screening is far from a neutral, objective scientific pursuit.
Right.
It is deeply political and deeply ethical.
Because screening drains immense systemic resources and inevitably causes some degree of harm through false positives and overdiagnosis. The decision to implement or maintain a program is fraught with complex ethical choices.
Absolutely.
The text outlines 3 distinct levels of ethics in population screening. Let's walk through them, because this frames the entire debate.
Sure.
First, we have the societal or system level. This is the classic public health battle between utilitarian efficiency, doing the absolute greatest good for the greatest number of people with limited financial resources, versus the moral imperative of equity and fairness.
A prime example of this ethical tension is the ongoing debate around prostate cancer screening using the PSA test.
How does that play out?
Well, you have men's advocacy groups pointing out, quite understandably, that health systems routinely fund massive national screening programs for women's cancers.
Specifically breast and cervical cancer.
Right. Therefore, they argue, basic fairness, gender equity, and social justice demand that the state must fund a national prostate cancer screening program for men.
Even if the epidemiological data and the utilitarian efficiency arguments don't actually support universal prostate screening because of the massive overtreatment risks we just discussed.
Precisely. It becomes an issue of perceived societal fairness rather than pure data-driven science.
This system is pressured to implement a harmful program just to appear equitable.
Exactly. Then we move to the second ethical tier, the program level.
Okay, what's that?
This is the persistent debate between targeted versus universal screening.
Right.
From a purely mathematical and economic standpoint, targeted screening is highly efficient. You only screen the specific subpopulations that are at the highest statistical risk for the disease.
But the ethical trap there is stigmatization.
Yes.
If public health officials decide to only target specific socioeconomic classes, specific racial groups, or specific behavioral groups for a sexually transmitted disease screening program, you risk deeply stigmatizing those communities.
Exactly. You are officially labeling them as disease vectors in the eyes of the state.
It can cause immense social harm.
It really can. Universal screening, on the other hand, is much more socially equitable. Everyone in the country gets an equal invitation regardless of background, but it is vastly more expensive.
And crucially, it significantly lowers the overall positive predictive value of the program because you're suddenly testing massive populations of very low-risk individuals, driving up the false positives.
Exactly. Also, at the program level, we have to confront the dark historical shadow of eugenics, particularly when it comes to prenatal genetic screening.
Right.
We are offering parents advanced scientific choices about reproductive outcomes, which is clinically framed as maximizing patient autonomy.
But it raises profound, uncomfortable societal questions about what kind of human traits a society fundamentally values and what traits it systematically tries to eliminate.
It really does.
Which leads us directly to the third level, the individual level, specifically the ethics of autonomy and consent.
Right.
The text references Teresa Marteau's formal definition of informed choice. For a medical choice to be truly informed, Marteau argues it must be based on relevant knowledge, it must be consistent with the decision-maker's personal values, and it must be behaviorally implemented.
Which raises an important question, perhaps the most important clinical question we face.
What is that?
How can a patient possibly make a truly informed choice when the underlying statistics of screening are so opaque, so counterintuitive, and so poorly communicated by the medical establishment?
Right, let's look at the number needed to screen, or NNS. This is the metric that strips away all the marketing.
It really is.
The text cites researcher Peter Rembold's estimate for colon cancer screening.
Let's hear it.
To prevent one single death from colon cancer, you have to continually screen 1,374 people over a period of 5 years.
I want you to really think about what that means for the concept of informed consent. If you are a doctor, you essentially have to look a patient in the eye and tell them, if you and 1,373 of your closest friends undergo this highly invasive, deeply uncomfortable, and potentially risky bowel procedure every single year for 5 years.
Wow.
1,373 of you will experience absolutely zero life-saving benefit from it, but one of you won't die of colon cancer.
How does an individual human brain process that kind of probabilistic risk?
It's almost impossible.
Most people hear the phrase cancer screening and assume it's a one-to-one transactional benefit. They think, if I get screened, I am actively saving my life today. They don't realize they're essentially participating in a massive statistical lottery where the odds of personal individual benefit are incredibly small, but the risk of enduring a false positive or the trauma of overdiagnosis is mathematically guaranteed for a large chunk of the participating group.
Exactly. And because the mathematical information required to truly understand that risk is so technically complex, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics introduced a vital concept to help manage this.
What's that?
The state's stewardship role.
Stewardship?
Yes. They argue that in a democratic society, it is entirely legitimate for the state or the public health apparatus to act as a steward.
Meaning what, practically?
The state takes on the burden of making the hard, utilitarian, data-driven decisions about which programs are actually safe enough to implement, while simultaneously discharging its duty to transparently educate the public so individuals can make choices that align with their own personal risk tolerance.
So the state acts as a filter, balancing the terrifying math, so the individual patient doesn't have to navigate that statistical minefield entirely alone.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say the ethics clear the Bioethics Council, the math works out, the positive predictive value is acceptable, and the government funding is secured. We move to the operational phase.
Yeah.
How do you actually build this massive public health machinery without it collapsing under its own logistical weight?
To build it successfully, you have to be acutely aware of the knowing-doing gap.
The knowing-doing gap.
Right. This is a phenomenon where a new diagnostic test simply diffuses into routine clinical practice just because enthusiastic doctors start pushing it or patients start demanding it.
Before it's ready.
Exactly. Long before there has been any formal evaluation, systemic planning, or standardized protocol established.
The text uses the introduction of early ultrasound in pregnancy as the classic example of this gap.
It's the perfect example.
The technology became inexpensive. It had incredibly broad public support because expectant parents naturally wanted to see pictures of their babies.
Of course.
And so it just exploded into routine practice in the 70s and 80s before the healthcare system had formally evaluated exactly what the ultrasound was supposed to be looking for.
Right, how to standardize the fetal measurements across different hospitals, or what doctors should actually do with ambiguous or incidental findings.
It was clinical chaos.
Complete chaos. And to prevent that kind of chaos, you need to build massive, population-oriented, fail-safe systems.
Fail-safe system.
These systems are the bedrock of any successful screening program, and they must operate entirely independently of individual practitioners to eliminate human error.
What does a fail-safe system actually look like in practice? How does it function day to day?
Let's take the UK cervical screening call-recall system as the gold standard example.
Okay.
Before computerized IT systems, screening invitations were managed with literal index cards in physical boxes.
Oh, wow. That sounds terrible.
It was. If a card fell behind a desk, a woman might miss her screening, or worse, miss a positive result and eventually die of cervical cancer.
Just because of a lost card.
Exactly. The modern computerized call-recall system is designed so that no abnormal result can ever be lost due to human error.
How does it do that?
There are mandatory fail-safe actions required at every node of the network, at the level of the central call-recall computer, at the individual general practitioner's office, at the cytology laboratory analyzing the slide, and at the colposcopy clinic handling the follow-up.
But it's tracking everything.
The IT system actively tracks the patient across every single step. If an abnormal result is generated by the lab and a follow-up appointment isn't registered in the system within a strict time frame, the computer automatically triggers escalating alerts to the doctors until action is definitively taken.
It is a vast machine specifically designed to circumvent human fallibility.
It has to be.
And to formally evaluate if that machine is actually working, public health relies on Donabedian's dimensions of quality assurance.
Yes, Donabedian's framework.
These are the strict metrics a program must hit to justify its continued existence. Let's walk through them.
Sure. First is effectiveness.
Right. Is the program actually optimizing health gains and reducing mortality as promised?
Exactly. Then efficiency.
Meaning, are we getting maximal health benefit for the financial and human resources we are spending?
Right. Then equity.
Is the program accessible to everyone in the population, or are only the wealthy, urban, and well-educated demographics benefiting?
Exactly. Safety.
Are we successfully minimizing the systemic harms like radiation exposure, biopsy complications, and psychological trauma?
And finally, acceptability.
Does the target public actually want to participate, or do they find the test too invasive or culturally inappropriate?
And operating within that quality assurance framework, we have to make a vital, often misunderstood differentiation between criteria and standards.
It sounds like semantics, but in public health governance, it is a crucial distinction.
It is. Donabedian defines a criterion as an attribute used to draw an inference about quality. It is conceptual.
Conceptual.
A standard, however, is a specified rigid quantitative measure of exactly what is considered good or bad performance.
Let's ground that in reality. Give me a concrete example from the text.
Okay, look at the newborn screening program for sickle cell disease in England. Okay.
The criterion of the program is the best possible survival for affected infants.
That's the overarching conceptual goal.
Right. But you can't measure a concept. So the standard, the hard, unyielding metric that the entire program is judged against by the government is a mortality rate of less than 4 deaths per 1,000 person years of life for affected children under the age of 5.
Wow, that's very specific.
If the program data shows they are exceeding that standard, the system is objectively failing, alarms go off, and immediate intervention is required to fix the pathway.
Which perfectly highlights why centralized governance is so absolutely critical. The text stresses over and over that decisions to start, modify, or stop a screening program must be made at the highest national level, not at the local hospital or regional level.
Absolutely.
Why is that hierarchy so rigid?
It all comes down to controlling conflicts of interest. Local actors have local incentives.
Like what?
Well, a regional doctor might have specific academic research interests they want to pursue, so they push for screening to generate data.
Oh, a local hospital administrator might want to expand their radiology department to increase institutional revenue, so they promote more imaging.
Ah, and a private commercial biotechnology company definitely wants to sell more of their new testing kits to the local clinics.
Exactly. If you leave population screening decisions to local actors, the system will inherently be biased toward doing more screening, completely regardless of the population-level harms, the false positives, or the massive opportunity costs.
You absolutely need a strict, objective, third-party national oversight body like the UK National Screening Committee to act as the ultimate gatekeeper, insulated from local financial and academic pressures.
You do, because history has shown that once the screening machine starts rolling, it is almost impossible to stop it.
Which brings us to the most difficult phase of all, the ultimate challenge, stopping a rolling juggernaut.
It really is a juggernaut.
Building a national screening program is a massive logistical nightmare. But what happens when the underlying epidemiology of the disease changes, or new, undeniable evidence emerges, showing a beloved program is actually causing more systemic harm than good?
Right.
How do you turn off a machine that the public has been told is saving their lives?
It is arguably the hardest political maneuver in all of public health.
Why is it so hard?
And the reason why it is so difficult is perfectly encapsulated in a concept that researchers Angela Raffel and Muir Gray coined, The popularity paradox.
I love this concept. The popularity paradox states that the more harm a screening program causes through overdiagnosis and overtreatment, the more popular that program becomes with the general public.
It seems entirely backward to a rational observer. Why on earth would causing harm make a medical intervention more popular?
To explain this, imagine a faulty fire alarm system installed in a neighborhood. This system is completely defective. It goes off every single time someone simply lights a scented candle in their living room. And when it goes off, it automatically sprays highly corrosive flame-retardant foam all over the house.
That's terrible.
It is. It ruins the furniture, destroys the electronics, and causes thousands of dollars in damage.
Right.
But because the homeowner is suddenly standing in a living room completely filled with foam, they think to themselves, wow, thank God for this system. It just saved my entire house from burning down. They become the biggest, most vocal advocate for the foam system, completely unaware that the tiny candle was never actually going to burn their house down in the first place. If the city tries to remove the defective fire alarms, the homeowners will riot. They'll say, you can't take away the system that saved my family.
That is the exact psychological mechanism of overdiagnosis in cancer screening.
Let's lay it out.
Let's say a national screening program overdiagnoses 1,000 people with microscopic, indolent, completely harmless cancers, the turtles we talked about earlier. All 1,000 of those healthy people are pushed into surgery and radiation. They suffer the painful side effects, they lose time from work, they face massive medical bills.
So eventually, they all survive.
And of course they survive because the cancer was never going to kill them anyway.
But the patients don't know that. They were told they had cancer, they got treated, and now they are alive.
Exactly. They genuinely, deeply believe that the screening program saved their lives.
Wow.
They become the most passionate, vocal, politically active advocates for the program. They start charities, they lobby local politicians, they speak to the media about their survival story.
So the more a program overdiagnoses healthy people, the more survivors it artificially creates.
And those survivors will politically defend the program to the death, making it politically toxic for any public health official to suggest shutting it down.
It is a self-reinforcing loop of perceived success built entirely on a foundation of actual medical harm.
It really is.
So with that immense political pressure, how has any program ever been successfully stopped?
The text points to a very specific historical example, the Japanese neuroblastoma screening program.
This is the absolute textbook case study of how public health can carefully dismantle a juggernaut.
It really is. Neuroblastoma is a type of pediatric cancer.
Right.
Japan started a massive nationwide program screening infants for neuroblastoma in 1985 by testing their urine for specific catecholamine metabolites at 6 months of age.
It was hugely popular with parents.
Oh, immensely popular. But by 1990, epidemiological data started to look strange.
What happened?
The incidence rate of neuroblastoma skyrocketed. They were finding tons of it. But the actual mortality rate for older children didn't budge at all. An international panel evaluated the data and concluded the program was finding tumors that naturally, spontaneously regress on their own.
So they're finding the turtles.
Exactly. The program was not reducing mortality, but it was causing severe harm because infants were undergoing unnecessary, highly risky surgeries to remove harmless tumors, and some infants were dying from the surgical complications.
The evidence was undeniable in 1990. But it took the Japanese government until 2014 years later to finally officially stop the program.
Yes.
Why did it take so incredibly long, and how did they eventually succeed without a massive public revolt?
They succeeded because they carefully cultivated a perfect political and scientific storm.
How so?
First, they gathered irrefutable, independent evidence from massive international studies to back up their claims.
Okay, the science was solid.
Second, they took the time to deeply educate the mainstream media on the nuances of overdiagnosis, so when the announcement was made, the press supported the government's scientific recommendation instead of sensationalizing it as government cuts cancer funding.
That's incredibly smart.
Third, there was limited prior public demand from parents before the program started, so it wasn't a grassroots movement they had to defeat.
And crucially, because it was a condition affecting very young infants who obviously don't have political agency, rather than adults, there were no adult advocacy groups lobbying to keep the program alive.
Exactly. There was no organized cohort of adult survivors of overdiagnosis fighting the shutdown.
It shows just how intensely political the science of screening really is.
It really is.
And it ties directly into the economic law of diminishing returns. even a good, highly effective screening program, if it is allowed to grow unchecked beyond its optimal size, for example, screening people too frequently or expanding the screening age groups to include demographics where the baseline risk is too low.
It will inevitably reach a tipping point.
It reaches a point where every extra dollar spent buys exponentially more harm through false positives than it does actual health gain.
You have to constantly evaluate the data and possess the political courage to restrict the scope.
Which is the perfect segue to our final major topic area. To bring all these mathematical, economic, and ethical frameworks together, we have to look at how they are applied across the lifespan, and we must tackle the most emotionally charged area of all: cancer screening.
Yes, cancer.
For the medical trainees and public health students listening, this next part is absolute board exam gold. You must deeply understand the two great epidemiological biases that fundamentally warp how we perceive the success of any cancer screening program.
Length time bias and lead time bias.
Let's tackle them clearly, one by one.
Let's start with length time bias. I want you to think about tumors as animals moving at vastly different speeds.
Okay.
You have turtle tumors that are highly indolent. They grow incredibly slowly over years or even decades.
Right.
And then you have rabbit tumors that are highly aggressive, mutating rapidly and growing explosively in a matter of months.
If you were running a national screening program and testing a patient every 2 years, which type of tumor are you mathematically more likely to catch in your net?
You are almost guaranteed to catch the turtles.
Because they're just hanging around longer.
Exactly. Because the turtle tumors exist in the body for such a long time without causing any clinical symptoms, your 2-year screening window has a massive overlap with their existence. You have years to spot them.
But the rabbits?
They grow so fast that they often emerge, grow, and cause lethal symptoms in the gap between the 2-year screening intervals.
In epidemiology, we call these interval cancers.
Exactly.
So length time bias means that screening programs disproportionately catch the slow-growing, benign tumors, the turtles.
Yes.
And because they catch so many slow-growing tumors, it makes the screening program look incredibly successful on paper because everyone diagnosed through the screening program survives a really long time.
But in reality, they survived a long time because they had a biologically slow tumor, not because the screening intervention saved them.
Meanwhile, the aggressive rabbit tumors are still killing people between the screens, completely untouched by the program.
Exactly. It creates a statistical illusion of efficacy.
Wow. And then we have the second major illusion, lead time bias.
Right. Lead time bias is the illusion of prolonged survival time.
I want to walk through a specific timeline for this one. Imagine a patient named John.
Okay, John.
In a world without screening, John's tumor grows silently in his body until the year 2025, when it finally gets big enough that he feels a lump. He goes to the doctor, he is diagnosed with advanced cancer, and sadly, despite treatment, he dies in the year 2027. His official survival time from the date of diagnosis is exactly 2 years.
Okay, it's simple enough. Now let's rewind the clock and put John into a massive national screening program.
Right. We screen John in the year 2020.
Our advanced scanner finds the tiny tumor 5 whole years before he ever would have felt a lump. We immediately treat him.
But let's say his particular tumor is biologically resistant. The early treatment doesn't change the ultimate outcome.
John still dies in the exact same month in the year 2027.
Wait, hold on. If John dies in 2027 in both scenarios, the screening program didn't buy him a single extra day of actual life. But what does the public health data show?
The official data shows that John survived for 7 years after his diagnosis instead of 2. The screening program will point to John and claim a massive success. They will issue press releases saying, "Our program increased survival time by 5 years."
But John didn't live a single day longer.
We didn't increase his lifespan, we just increased his disease span.
We took 5 years of healthy, blissful ignorance away from him, and we gave him 5 extra years of being a terrified cancer patient undergoing toxic treatments.
That is the cruelty of lead time bias. Early detection simply pushed the diagnosis date backward, making survival time look mathematically longer without changing the actual date of death.
These two biases, length time and lead time, are exactly why the evaluation of cancer screening is so fiercely, bitterly debated in the medical literature.
Oh, it's a war zone.
Let's do a deep dive review of how this plays out across the different specific programs mentioned in the text. First, the most emotive and politically charged of all, breast cancer screening.
The academic and political debates here are ferocious, and they have been raging for decades.
Lay out the sides for us.
On one side, you have the establishment view, largely stemming from the original Forrest report in the UK in the 1980s, which looked at the early RCTs and strongly pushed for national mammography screening, arguing it significantly reduced breast cancer mortality.
Okay, and the other side.
On the other side, you have vehement, highly credentialed critics like Peter Goetsche from the Nordic Cochrane Center.
What's their argument?
Goetsche and his team reanalyzed the data decades later and argued that the early trials were flawed. They argue that the systemic harms of mammography, the massive rate of false positives, the cumulative radiation exposure, and specifically the massive overdiagnosis of dormant conditions like DCIS far outweigh the marginal mortality benefits.
It has become a highly politicized environment where questioning the efficacy of the program is often viewed as politically toxic, completely regardless of the nuanced epidemiological data.
It really has.
Next, let's look at cervical cancer. We mentioned Angela Raffles' data earlier in the context of the popularity paradox.
Right.
Her research showed that it takes screening 1,000 women continuously for 35 years to prevent just one single death from cervical cancer. The computerized call-recall system they built is a logistical marvel of public health engineering. But what happens to that system now?
The entire paradigm is shifting rapidly. With the highly successful introduction of the HPV vaccine for adolescents, the underlying prevalence of the human papillomavirus, which causes the vast majority of cervical cancer, will inevitably plummet in the coming decades.
And as that baseline prevalence drops,
The positive predictive value of the traditional cytological smear test will drop right along with it.
so what does the system do?
Eventually, the public health system will have to adapt. It will likely have to scale down or completely stop widespread, frequent cytological screening because the upstream biological intervention of the vaccine has rendered the downstream scanner obsolete and economically unjustifiable.
We've already touched briefly on prostate cancer and the PSA blood test. It remains the absolute textbook example of overtreatment risk because, as the old urology saying goes, many men die with prostate cancer, but not of it.
The turtles vastly outnumber the rabbits.
But what about genetic screening? This feels like an entirely different ethical universe.
Genetic screening introduces a profound new layer of complexity because you are dealing with inherited traits.
All right.
We screen certain high-risk populations for autosomal recessive conditions like Tay-Sachs disease and thalassemia to inform reproductive choices.
And for newborns, standard heel prick testing for conditions like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease is designed to find affected infants so we can start life-saving treatment immediately.
But in doing so, the test also invariably identifies carriers infants who have the genetic trait but will never actually develop the disease themselves.
And that creates a massive dilemma. Do you tell the parents about the carrier status even though the baby isn't sick?
That has been a massive ethical debate. The UK Human Genetics Commission eventually decided that, yes, carrier status should be revealed to the parents to ensure they have a complete understanding of the genetic risk for any future pregnancies.
But here is the unexpected, explosive ethical landmine of genetic screening.
Oh, boy.
When you clinically test the mother, the father, and the baby to map the inheritance of the trait, you inevitably uncover cases of non-paternity.
You do.
The genetic data mathematically proves that the man sitting in the clinic who thinks he is the father is biologically not the father.
It's devastating.
It is a devastating, family-destroying piece of collateral information generated completely by accident during a routine public health screen. How the system handles that data is one of the most fraught areas of medical ethics.
It is the ultimate unintended consequence of looking too closely.
Finally, let's touch on cardiovascular disease and diabetes. We used to talk about screening for these.
Yes, but here, the text notes a major philosophical shift in public health strategy. Instead of rigidly screening for a specific disease using a strict binary cutoff, saying you either have diabetes or you don't, programs like the NHS Health Check in the UK are moving toward opportunistic case finding and whole population systemic risk reduction.
What does that mean in practice?
You look at a matrix of factors: cholesterol, blood pressure, BMI, lifestyle, smoking status. It's about collaboratively managing risk across a continuum with the patient, rather than giving a binary label that triggers a rigid treatment protocol.
It is a much more holistic, realistic approach to human biology. Okay, we have covered an absolutely incredible amount of ground today. From the rigid mathematics of specificity and the prevalence trap, to the deeply human ethical minefields of overdiagnosis and opportunity costs, all the way to the bizarre psychology of the popularity paradox.
We really covered it all.
To wrap this up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, a scenario to ponder over the coming days that builds on everything we just discussed.
Let's hear it.
We are currently entering the era of commercial liquid biopsies. You may have already seen the advertisements.
Oh, yeah.
These are highly marketed, extremely expensive blood tests claiming to be able to detect 50 or more types of cancer at once from a single, simple blood draw.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, they are being marketed and sold directly to consumers, completely bypassing the traditional public health gatekeepers.
Right.
Based on what we have learned today about positive predictive value, the devastating prevalence trap in asymptomatic populations, and the immense psychological power of the popularity paradox. What happens to our fragile global public health infrastructure when millions of healthy, wealthy people demand full-body MRI scans, specialist consultations, and invasive surgical biopsies to chase down statistical false alarms generated by a commercial blood test?
It's a terrifying thought.
Are we engineering our own catastrophic public health crisis through the relentless, unregulated pursuit of more diagnostic data? Just because our technology can look closer than ever before, does it mean we should?
It is, without a doubt, the defining public health and health economics question of our generation. As we have seen today, detection without discernment is not prevention. It is simply chaos.
Let that simmer in your mind. Now, to lock in these complex frameworks we've built, let's transition to our rapid recall segment. I will read 5 single best answer prompts based exactly on the material we just deeply covered. I will pause briefly, and then our expert will provide the definitive answer and the specific chapter reference so you know exactly where to look in the textbook. Let's go.
Ready?
Prompt 1. What is the fundamental systemic distinction that differentiates true population screening from opportunistic case finding?
Answer. Population screening systematically and proactively targets asymptomatic, ostensibly healthy populations by inviting them to be tested, whereas case finding applies tests non-systematically to patients who are already seeking care within the healthcare system for other reasons. You can review this foundational concept in the section titled Concepts in Screening, Definitions.
Prompt 2. In a population with a very low baseline prevalence of a specific disease, what is the most likely, mathematically guaranteed consequence of deploying a screening test that boasts 95% sensitivity and 95% specificity?
Answer. A remarkably low positive predictive value, or PPV. Because of the prevalence trap, this means the vast majority of positive results handed to patients will actually be false positives. Review this crucial math under consideration of test performance.
Prompt 3. A retrospective evaluation of a national cancer screening program proudly shows a significantly increased survival time from the date of diagnosis for participants, but the overall population mortality rate for that specific cancer remains completely unchanged. What epidemiological bias best explains this phenomenon?
Answer. Lead time bias. The diagnosis was simply made earlier in the patient's life, increasing the amount of time the patient knew they had the disease, but the early intervention did not extend their actual chronological lifespan. Refer to screening in adults, cancer, to solidify this concept.
Prompt 4. A long-running screening program successfully detects many indolent, slow-growing tumors, but consistently misses the highly aggressive tumors that emerge and cause death in the gap between the scheduled screening intervals. What is this phenomenon called?
Answer. Length time bias. Slow-growing tumors, the turtles, have a much longer asymptomatic phase, making them statistically far more likely to be caught by a periodic scheduled screen than the fast-growing rabbits. Refer again to screening in adults. Cancer.
Prompt 5. According to researchers Raffel and Gray, what exactly is the popularity paradox in the context of public health screening?
Answer. The paradox states that the greater the harm a program causes through the overdiagnosis and overtreatment of harmless abnormalities, the more people falsely believe the program directly saved their lives. This artificially creates vocal advocates, making the harmful program more popular and politically harder to stop. Review this dynamic in the section, Evaluating, Restricting, and Stopping Existing Programs.
Excellent work. So the next time you are standing in a long, frustrating line at an airport security checkpoint, I want you to watch that scanner. Listen to it beep. Watch the agents pull someone aside to meticulously check their bag for a foil wrapper. And remember the incredibly delicate, mathematically precise, and deeply human calibration required to keep the entire system moving safely. Sometimes knowing exactly what to ignore is just as important as knowing what to look for. Thanks for diving deep with us. Here are the details of this episode.
Population screening. Title. Population screening, byline. Medlock Holmes explores screening as a preventative strategy balancing early detection, benefit, harm, and ethical responsibility at the population level. Episode description. Population screening aims to detect disease before symptoms arise, shifting intervention earlier in the disease pathway. However, screening is not inherently beneficial. It requires careful evaluation of evidence, test accuracy, disease prevalence, and potential harms. This chapter examines principles of screening, including sensitivity, specificity, predictive values, overdiagnosis, lead time bias, and cost effectiveness. It reviews established screening programs such as breast, cervical, and colorectal cancer, as well as emerging technologies. Screening is framed as a calibrated intervention, powerful when appropriately applied, harmful when misused. Public health must balance early detection with ethical stewardship, ensuring programs are evidence-based, equitable, and proportionate. Detection without discernment risks unintended consequence. Key takeaways. Screening targets asymptomatic populations to detect early disease. The test performance depends on sensitivity, specificity, and prevalence. Overdiagnosis and false positives carry psychological and clinical consequences. Screening must meet established criteria before implementation. Equity and access are central to screening effectiveness. Ongoing evaluation is essential for program sustainability. Screening is prevention only when benefit outweighs harm.